All right, you guys, welcome to the start of the next unit. We are going to be covering vitamins today and minerals next week. So we'll talk a bit about the different types of vitamins, why they are important, as well as some deficiencies in vitamins that we can see. So what we're going to be talking about today, what are vitamins, right? What's considered a vitamin? What are the main functions of the different types of vitamins? And then we'll go through those different types, and we have two main groups of vitamins, fat soluble and water soluble. And what happens when we get those vitamin deficiencies, and which vitamins maybe are more common to have deficiencies in, and what those symptoms maybe look like for the vitamin deficiencies. So what are vitamins? I think a lot of us can recognize most vitamins. Either it's in the name or we know some vitamins that we need and maybe take vitamin supplements, things like that. But what are they? They're just organic compounds. So if we go back to, what an organic compound is, we have to have carbon, hydrogen, and then maybe oxygen, nitrogen, those compounds creating a molecule, those elements creating a molecule. So these are organic compounds that are present in very small or minute amounts in just natural food. So lots of foodstuffs have multiple vitamins in them, and vitamins really are essential for normal metabolism. So we'll talk a little bit more specifically what their functions are and what they're essential for here in a few minutes. And we said our two main groups of vitamins are fat-soluble vitamins and water soluble. So that means, what does the vitamin dissolve in? So if they're fat soluble, they can only dissolve in fat. And so we talked a little bit about, why we need fat in our diet as well. And one of those main reasons is to be able to absorb fat soluble vitamins. So we need that fat in our diet to be able to carry and absorb fat soluble vitamins. The water-soluble ones just dissolve in water, so they don't dissolve in fat, and they just dissolve in water. So those are mostly your B vitamins and vitamin C. And then those fat-soluble, we have 4 of them, and we'll go through each of these, so vitamin A, D, E, and K. So first, let's briefly go through each of these categories of vitamins, and then we'll go through each individual vitamin in more detail in a little bit. So those fat-soluble vitamins, A, D, E, and K, they have a lot of important functions in the body, and it's variable in what those functions are. So we'll cover those in the little graphic I have here. It just kind of gives us some general functions of each of those fat-soluble vitamins. But one of the big things is about fat-soluble vitamins is we can actually store some of the fat-soluble vitamins. The most of them we can. So we can store A, D, and E. And a lot of that storage usually happens in the liver. So we can store these vitamins and we can utilize them later if maybe we're becoming a little deficient in that vitamin. But the other problem with being able to store these fat-soluble vitamins is that they can become toxic if you have too much of that vitamin. So because we can store it, it can become toxic because the levels in our body can become higher and higher if we are consuming more and more of that vitamin and just continue to store it, okay? So again, we'll go through these individual vitamins and their functions. So this is just a reference table. You don't need to memorize it, just to kind of give you a brief introduction to these different fat-soluble vitamins. And again, we're going to go through them individually, but it just shows you kind of what the required amount is of each vitamin. Sometimes there's a difference between men and women's requirements. And then what best food sources can you get these vitamins from? And a little bit about the functions, okay? So again, we're going to go through these individually, but just kind of to give you an idea of them before we dive into them in more detail. So now let's get a brief introduction of those water-soluble vitamins. So we said that it's mostly the B vitamins and vitamin C. So there are a couple more as well that we name, and biotin is a B vitamin, but we usually just call it biotin instead of its, vitamin B7. And then choline, which is a little bit different than some of our other water-soluble vitamins, and we'll talk about that, as well as folacin. And these guys, we said that fat-soluble vitamins, we have body storage of most of them, and that can make them toxic if we have too much buildup of them. But these are relatively non-toxic because we don't have a body storage, except for vitamin B12, which is a little bit different. But because we don't store them and we rely on consuming them, we do see some deficiencies in these water-soluble vitamins. And that's why, a lot of things have added B vitamins in them. You can take them as supplements, but really, if you're already at a good level, you're just going to pass them and excrete them in your urine. So you don't store them. And really, if you were talking about ruminants, their microbes in their intestines actually make a lot of their vitamins. So they don't even require a dietary source of water-soluble vitamins. So that's kind of cool as well, kind of going along with ruminants as kind of our, strange friends out there that have a lot of different requirements. So here's a similar table for some of these water-soluble vitamins, just showing you, how much is required in our diet, what those best sources are for those vitamins, and what the functions are. And if you notice, and I forgot to mention on the last table as well, if you notice the amounts are in, milligrams and micrograms. That kind of looks like the little U is a microgram. So these are, in very relatively small quantities that are required in our diet. Okay, so we really don't need a lot of these vitamins to provide the functions that are required. So here's just a comparison table between our fat-soluble and water-soluble vitamins. So it's just a little bit of a breakdown to show you the differences between them. And obviously some of the big differences are, the fat versus water solubility, as well as the absorption of those vitamins. So the fat-soluble vitamins are a little harder to absorb, and they really require those lipids and bile salts to be able to be absorbed, which is quite important. As well as storage, right? So we do store those fat-soluble vitamins in our liver, whereas we really don't have much storage of the water-soluble vitamins. And we'll talk about the deficiencies a little bit, as well as the toxicities. And we really don't see toxicity in those water-soluble vitamins. So now let's get into some of the general functions of vitamins in our body, and then we'll touch a little bit on the specific functions of each of the different vitamins. But these are kind of the big picture things. So vitamins definitely play a big role in metabolic processes. So what they usually act as are coenzymes. So now that we know a little bit more about what enzymes are, because we talked about them in our protein lecture, and we make enzymes out of proteins, and so these guys speed up those reactions, those chemical reactions in the body that are very important for our metabolism. But some of these enzymes don't function either correctly or as well without something called a cofactor or coenzyme. And these vitamins can act as that coenzyme. So essentially, the coenzyme is going to bind the enzyme itself at that kind of activation site. And essentially, it's going to make that enzyme either more effective or even activate it so that it can bind that substrate for that chemical reaction. So coenzymes can be very important in these metabolic processes. So that's a big function of vitamins. And because it affects all these metabolic processes, it can affect a lot of different body systems at the same time. So one vitamin can affect a lot of different systems. So that can come into play when we look at deficiencies as well, and what kind of symptoms come out of the deficiencies, because so many body systems can be affected by these enzymes. And when we're talking about water-soluble vitamins, a lot of them affect growth. So growth of animals. So, you can definitely see stunted growth with deficiencies. That's a big one. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. Okay. So now let's start talking about those individual vitamins, and we're going to start with the fat-soluble vitamins. So there's only 4 of them, right? So let's start with vitamin A. And these are required by all animals. They're also referred to as retinoids, okay? So vitamin A is also called retinol. And so if you see that retinol or retinoids, that's referring to vitamin A. And so the big precursor to vitamin A is carotenoids. So carotenoids is a group of compounds, and more specifically beta-carotene you guys have probably heard of. And beta-carotene is probably the most well-known precursor to vitamin A. So we turn beta-carotene into vitamin A or retinol. So what is the function of retinol or vitamin A? And a big one has to do with vision, and more specifically night vision. So that can be one of our deficiencies is night blindness. So we'll talk about that. Growth, cell differentiation, and metabolism. So those are kind of things we've already talked a little bit about as kind of general functions of growth, metabolism. But it also has a big function in bone formation, remodeling, even reproduction. So those kind of come into play as well. And we won't go into the specifics of how the vitamin is responsible for those things or function in those things, but just to give you kind of an idea of how diverse these functions are and how many body systems they affect, right? But a big thing is this antioxidant activity with the carotenoids. So carotenoids are very important for kind of antioxidant activity. Same with another of our fat-soluble vitamins, vitamin E, we'll talk about as well, has a lot of antioxidant activity. So if we talk about those deficiencies, night blindness is a big one, okay? So I just kind of highlighted that one. Obviously we can get some other deficiency because of, its effect on all these different body systems, okay? But even death. So you wouldn't think that a vitamin deficiency would lead to death, but in extreme cases, it can, okay? So we do have some of these eye problems that we can see with deficiencies. So, corneal ulcers, different kind of spots on the eye, but a big one is night blindness as well. And because it's a fat-soluble vitamin, we can see toxicities as well because we store those fat-soluble vitamins in our liver. So if you just have too much of vitamin A, you can get some toxicities. And this we kind of see in some of our apex predators that will eat whole animals, livers. So liver really contains the highest level of vitamin A. And so if some animals eat maybe too many livers that have a lot of vitamin A in it, you can see some of these toxicities, which can be anorexia, dermatitis, thinning bones, hemorrhage. So some of these crazy things that sometimes it's interesting because the toxicities can mirror the deficiencies, which is kind of interesting if you think about it. And dermatitis is a big symptom of a lot of deficiencies and toxicities, so it's a very general problem. So it's hard to say because that animal has dermatitis, it's this specific vitamin or not. So these symptoms can be very general, so it can be hard to say, okay, it's that vitamin that's causing that symptom, right? There could be a slew of different causes. But essentially think liver, vitamin A, toxicity, animals that may be consuming lots of livers. So this is just kind of a fun picture that helps remind us kind of where vitamin A or retinol comes from, what are the best sources, what are some of the health benefits. It gives you the structural compound of vitamin A. So because that beta carotene is a precursor, that is those orange or yellow kind of vegetables, things like that we say have a lot of beta carotene in it. So that's a great source for vitamin A, are these vegetables with a lot of beta carotene in them, such as carrots, right? So these are just kind of fun pictures that I have for a lot of these vitamins to help remind us of the different functions and benefits and sources. Okay, and you can always refer back to those tables as well. So vitamin D is our next fat-soluble vitamin, and a lot of people are very familiar with vitamin D, especially these days, because a lot of us humans are deficient in vitamin D these days because it's termed kind of the sunshine vitamin because we require UV light in our skin to convert these precursors to the active form of vitamin D. So vitamin D is found in both plants and animals. And there's a precursor in plants and our skin in animals that require that UV light to essentially convert it into the active form of vitamin D, cholecalciferol. And so that is a big source of vitamin D for us, is in our skin, and we convert it with that UV light from that sterol precursor. And now we know a little bit more about sterols, right? So such as cholesterol is a sterol, so they're these fats, right, that make up hormones and things like that that we talked about in our last the fat lecture. So there is a dietary source of vitamin D as well, and fish is a big one, as well as dairy products, so and some veggies. So there are some good dietary sources of vitamin D out there as well, but a lot of us get our vitamin D from the sun. So what are the normal functions of vitamin D? right? So a big one is normal bone mineralization. So we require cholecalciferol to mineralize our bones, that calcium and phosphorus, those minerals that we put into our bones. So that's a very important function, as well as our immune system, and specifically those T cells, which are lymphocytes. So very important in the immune system also. And so especially these days with everything going on with COVID, a lot of recommendations are to supplement with vitamin D because it does help our immune system so well. And so we do store vitamin D in our liver, so we convert it and store it in the liver. And so we can see some toxicity with vitamin D as well. So we'll talk about that. So we just said we've been seeing a lot of deficiencies in vitamin D. So what are some extreme deficiencies that we see? Well, we can get abnormal skeletal growth or formation in both children and adults. So if it's in children, we can see this kind of more in, third world countries where, nutrition is not very good. So we call it rickets, and you see these kind of bowed limbs because their long bones don't ossify or mineralize correctly. We do see it in adults as well, osteomalacia. So it's the same problem, right? That you don't get the correct mineralization of the bones, but can be more extreme in children because that's when the bones are growing and developing. So we do see both of those problems with extreme vitamin D deficiency. So you see the same thing as you would if you were calcium and phosphorus deficient as well. So just because you have these symptoms, osteomalacia, rickets, bowed tendons, lameness, sore joints, it could be, again, some multiple sources, but vitamin D is one of them, along with low calcium, low phosphorus. Could be a combination, right? So again, just like I said, you can't say this symptom necessarily has to go with that deficiency of that vitamin, but it's just on your differential list, right? So again, what's a fat-soluble vitamin? We're storing it in the liver, so we can get toxicity as well. And you can see calcification of soft tissues, which is very abnormal, right? We don't want to calcify our soft tissues, especially kidneys, lungs, aorta. So definitely things we don't want to calcify, we can, and so that can be a problem with toxicity. Usually toxicities are a lot more rare than deficiencies, okay? So here's just another fun image to remind us a little bit about vitamin D and how we need ultraviolet light to convert those sterols in the skin into our active form of vitamin D, cholecalciferol. And we do have some food sources for vitamin D as well. So now let's talk a little bit about vitamin E. So this is also called tocopherol. So just all of these vitamins also have another name, right? So I want you to be familiar with both names for these vitamins. And vitamin E is very unstable, so it's a very unstable compound, and it's actually found in most animal tissue, okay? A lot of muscle, and we'll talk a little bit more about muscle, but it has a very limited biological activity, okay? So it's found in the tissue, so it doesn't have a lot to do with enzymatic activity, those types of functions. There are some good dietary sources of vitamin E, multigrains, nuts, oils specifically as a big one, as well as those leafy greens. And we'll talk a bit more about its interactions, especially with minerals, specifically selenium. So they kind of work hand in hand together for a lot of stuff, as well as those polyunsaturated fatty acids, or PUFAs, those omega fatty acids, also work together with vitamin E. Okay. So what are some functions? And the biggest function to remember for vitamin E is its antioxidant activity. So it's a free radical scavenger, and we'll talk about a little bit more about what that means, because vitamin A also has antioxidant activity. But it does have some function in nucleic acid and protein metabolism. So we talked a bit about protein metabolism, right? The building and breaking down of proteins and amino acids. So it does have some function there, but a big one is cell membrane structure too, and that has a little bit to do with the antioxidant activity. So we'll see what that is here in a second, okay? So when we talk about antioxidants and having these free radical scavengers, what happens is an atom can become a free radical essentially when it loses an electron. So that can happen for multiple different reasons. Some sort of damage to the tissues can cause these free radicals. And the biggest thing is the free radicals then are unstable, and they can go and destroy things like cell membranes because they oxidize those phospholipids that are making up the membrane. So free radicals can be very damaging to our cell membranes and our tissues. So we don't want them, right? So free radicals are bad, but we're constantly producing free radicals. It's just part of how living and damage happens, right? So what happens is these antioxidants, such as vitamin E, vitamin A, they donate their own electrons essentially to create a neutralized atom. So those free radicals have lost an electron and they need an electron, so they borrow it or steal it from something like alpha tocopherol, which is vitamin E. So then it becomes stable again. So you're essentially neutralizing those free radicals. So that's where the term free radical scavenger comes from, is because they kind of donate their electrons and neutralize all those free radicals, which is obviously a very important function in our body to try to prevent this damage that these free radicals do to our cell membranes. So what are some deficiencies that we see with vitamin E? So these can be very extreme deficiencies and disorders that we can see. So there are two big ones, nutritional muscular dystrophy, or also called white muscle disease, as well as encephalomalacia. So these can be very extreme. So you're essentially destroying the normal muscle tissue. So you see that it's white instead of red, so you don't have that normal myoglobin in the muscle tissue. And encephalomalacia has to do with brain dysfunction. And so you see these kind of crazy neurological signs with encephalomalacia. And these can be very severe disorders. So what happens is you can get an increased requirement of vitamin E with those omega fatty acids. So if you increase your vitamin E requirement, it's to help protect them from oxidation. Okay, so you want to protect your omega fatty acids, right? Because we said that those free radicals can damage fats and phospholipids and cell membranes and things like that. So you require more vitamin E to protect them from oxidation. Okay, so as you eat more or eat more things with omega fatty acids in there, you should also increase your vitamin E intake as well to just help protect them. We'll talk a little bit more about selenium in our mineral lecture as well, but we said that vitamin E also interacts with some minerals, and very specifically selenium. So if you have enough selenium, it actually can spare vitamin E and prevent some of these deficiencies that we see with vitamin E. But selenium can also be very toxic. So vitamin E itself is relatively non-toxic, but selenium can be very toxic. It has a very small safety margin, essentially. So we'll talk a little bit more about selenium in our mineral lecture. But another thing that can happen with vitamin E is if you take kind of vitamin E with vitamin K together, or you have too much vitamin E, it can actually antagonize vitamin K, which means it can block the function of vitamin K. And vitamin K is very important for coagulation and blood clotting, so you can see some anticoagulation effects with vitamin E as well. So it's relatively non-toxic. You don't see a lot of toxicity with vitamin E, but these are some effects that can happen with it as well. But more importantly are those deficiencies. Okay. So there's been a lot of studies and comparisons done and use for vitamin E in kind of dermatology, right? So, they say that it can, reduce stretch marks, scars, help with dry skin, help prevent UV damage, all of that good stuff, which there's a lot of research to support, and I've included an article here. But the big thing is the compound of vitamin E and what form it's in, because we said that it's a very unstable compound. So it depends on what type of vitamin E is in it, and if a lot of these topical forms are actually effective or not. And so it really depends on the compound of vitamin E and if they can keep it stable enough to do a lot of these beneficial functions. So just an interesting article here if you're interested in it, because it is a very common, popular thing out there for a lot of dermatological products. So let's finish off our fat-soluble vitamins with vitamin K. So vitamin K is very cool. It is required for normal blood clotting. So that's what I want you to remember with vitamin K. We do see three forms of it. One is synthetic, that we use as a medicine for anticoagulants. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. But the two natural forms that we see are phylloquinone, which is found in those leafy green plant vegetables. Our cruciferous vegetables have lots of vitamin K. So that's kind of our nutritional source, but we also see microbial synthesis as well in our GI tract. So we do get some production even without a dietary source, and that is menaquinone. So that's K2, vitamin K2. So we do see a couple different sources of vitamin K. It does have some function in bone metabolism as well, but what I really want you to remember is its function in blood clotting. So when we talk about vitamin K deficiency, it's not a true vitamin deficiency. It's usually caused by an antagonist or inhibitor, meaning that a drug is going to block the action or the production of vitamin K. So true deficiency are uncommon because we do have that GI microbial synthesis going on. So even if you were to, not eat a leafy green and not get that dietary source of vitamin K, you would still have a source, a microbial source of vitamin K. So what do we see with these antagonists or inhibitors? And that's prolonged clotting time. So essentially you're unable to clot your blood, which is coagulation, so anticoagulants, but you do see death as well if it's bad enough. So antibiotics can somewhat cause a little bit of a deficiency as well if you kill those good microbes that are producing the vitamin K. But again, you could get it in the diet as well. So not as common. The big one is warfarin or rat poison, which is an anticoagulant. Okay, so it's going to block the activity of our vitamin K, and we'll look a little bit about how that works here in a minute. Now, vitamin K is relatively non-toxic, okay? So we don't really see a toxicity with vitamin K. We don't really store it in our liver like we see with our other fat-soluble vitamins, so we don't really see toxicity with vitamin K. Now, with the synthetic form, it can be toxic to the skin and respiratory system, and that's just the synthetic form, so that's not as common, right? So how does warfarin work, right? So it's an anticoagulant. It's what we see in rat poison, but warfarin is also a medication, right? So taken at a safe dose can help with blood thinning, anticoagulant. But how does it actually work? So first we have to look at how vitamin K actually helps with blood clotting. So it helps by sticking the blood cells together. Okay, so vitamin K is produced in it. It's part of the compounds that stick and hold blood cells together to form a clot. Okay. So if you have a product like warfarin or an anticoagulant, it actually reduces the body's ability to make that vitamin K. So you have a problem with vitamin K production, so you're unable to create those blood clotting molecules that help stick the blood cells together. Okay, so you're unable to make it's fibrin, and the fibrin sticks the blood cells together. Okay, so you're unable to clot your blood as well if you have these anticoagulants. Okay, and which can be helpful in certain circumstances where you may need some blood thinning and things like that, or anticoagulants for a treatment, but it can also be very detrimental in something like rat poison, which is meant for killing things, right? So that is how warfarin actually works. So here's our fun little thing about vitamin K, just showing the structure, health benefits, and the different sources. So if you notice, lots of green, leafy green, cruciferous vegetables, okay? So here's just a good summary of those fat-soluble deficiencies, okay? So just to kind of help you review a little bit about the differences of those deficiencies, and they're all very different. So fat-soluble vitamins have a lot of different functions and a lot of different, body systems that are affected, okay? So now let's go through those water-soluble vitamins. So we're going to go through some of the important ones, some of these B vitamins that have specific names and what their importance is, and maybe some of the deficiencies that we see with them. So again, we don't really see toxicities too much with those water-soluble vitamins because we don't store them, right? So thiamine is vitamin B1, and it's really present in most foodstuffs. So cereal grains, soy, greens, hay, animal products. So you see a lot of it in most foodstuffs. And it's very important in the cellular respiration or metabolism. So it's a coenzyme in the citric acid cycle or Krebs cycle. So it's very important for energy. We see it in carbohydrate and lipid metabolism as well. So remember, we said one of those big important general functions of vitamins is the coenzyme activity. So this is an important coenzyme in cellular respiration. So we do see some deficiencies in these guys, some classic signs in certain animals. But a big one is either cardiovascular or nervous system disorders. So you can see kind of enlarged hearts, weakness, some neurological signs like mental confusion, memory loss, anorexia. But again, we should get it in a lot of our foodstuffs. So deficiencies should be fairly rare. So we do see a lot of urine loss, so rapid urine loss. So it can be caused by either a low intake, which is fairly rare, but mostly we can see it being destroyed or damaged. So you're destroying your thiamine, so you're not getting enough of it. So either sulfur, high temps, moisture can damage or destroy thiamine, so then you're not getting enough. Okay, so you would think, hey, you should get a lot because it's in most foodstuffs, but essentially if you damage or destroy the thiamine, in the foodstuffs, then you're not getting the amount that you need, and then you can see a deficiency. So our next B vitamin is riboflavin, so that's B2. And animal products, green forages, vegetables are all good sources. You do see that it is sensitive to light, so it can be damaged as well, just like we were talking about damaging thiamine as well. So big function for riboflavin is another coenzyme function. Okay, so it's a coenzyme for FMN and FAD, which are those important electron carriers in the cell, in the cellular respiration cycle. Okay, so another big coenzyme in cellular respiration. Okay. So they make up kind of this group of flavoproteins, they call them, okay? And they function in oxidoreduction reactions as well. So, this is kind of going back to, biology review and things like that. But just know that they have a big function in the electron transport chain, electron carriers. Okay. So we do see some deficiency with riboflavin, and usually it involves the skin, the eyes, or the nervous system. It is less common because we do store some in our cells. So unlike, major storage in the liver, we do see some storage in the cells, but no animals can make it. So we do need it in our diet. So that can be a problem. If it's damaged, sunlight damage as well, but we do see some deficiencies. So usually it has to do with skin. You can see some dermatitis, some scaling around the mouth, eyes, and you can see some nervous system deficiency as well. So our third B vitamin, niacin, also called nicotinic acid. So this is conditionally essential because we can synthesize it from tryptophan, which is one of our amino acids. in most species. So sometimes we don't need it if we can make it, synthesize it from an amino acid. So that's why we call it conditionally essential. But some good dietary sources would be meats, yeast, leafy plants, things like that. And again, we're a coenzyme for those oxidoreductase reactions. So again, it's important electron carriers in that electron transport chain. So very similar to our riboflavin, right, vitamin B2 that we just talked about. So both have to do with cellular respiration and that electron transport chain. It's also important in DNA damage repair as well. So a little bit of, you know, some antioxidant activity there as well. So we do see some deficiencies, and we call it the 4 Ds. So dermatitis, diarrhea, dementia, and death, which doesn't sound very good. And all these kind of together is something that we see in humans called pellagra. So we do see niacin deficiency. And it can be due to a poor diet, like a corn-based diet, because corn grain is a poor source of niacin and tryptophan, and we said that we can make niacin from tryptophan. So if you're deficient in both of them, then you can see this deficiency, this overall deficiency. So if you're on a corn-based, grain-based diet, this can happen. Now, carnivores usually don't have a niacin deficiency, except cats, which actually has an enzyme that breaks down their NAD, which is part of that electron carrier situation. So they do require a dietary niacin. We do see that in cats as well. Now, we do see a toxicity with very high levels. You can get flushing, itching, nausea, headaches with high levels of niacin. But again, toxicity is not as common in these water-soluble vitamins. So our next vitamin, B vitamin, is pantothenic acid. Now the active form of this vitamin is coenzyme A, and most foodstuff has pantothenic acid. We do see a little bit lower in grain, just like we talked about niacin being a little lower in grain. But essentially, it's required for a lot of metabolism. So all three, fatty acid, carbohydrate, and protein metabolism require acetyl-CoA or succinyl-CoA. So that CoA, that coenzyme A, that's so important in a lot of these metabolic functions, is very important. Okay. So coenzyme A is the active form of pantothenic acid. Now we don't see as many deficiencies, it's very rare, but if you do see it, there's this interesting neuromuscular disorder called goose stepping, where they kind of have this high kick step that's very classic neuromuscular problem with this deficiency. You also see some dermatitis, right? I said dermatitis is very common with a lot of these vitamin deficiencies, as well as some GI disturbances. So don't panic. This is just reminding us about acetyl-CoA and how we get acetyl-CoA, why it's important, and the big one is the citric acid cycle. So that CoA, that coenzyme A, is that active form of our pantothenic acid. So again, it's just a very important coenzyme in a lot of our metabolic functions. So our next B vitamin, B6, has a bunch of different forms. So there's actually 5 different forms. pyridoxine, pyridoxal phosphate, pyridoxamine phosphate. So lots of different forms, but that pyridox is the commonality between all of them there. So think protein metabolism when you think vitamin B6. So its requirements increase with protein intake or during pregnancy, lactation, when you require more protein. So lots of good sources: meats, liver, cereal grains, vegetables, lots of diverse foodstuffs for vitamin B6. So again, really think amino acid metabolism, right? So when you're going to transaminate, deaminate all those proteins and amino acids, very important for that, okay? Also important for formation of hormones, those peptide hormones that we talked about, protein hormones as well. So really go hand in hand with protein. So the more protein requirement you need, the more vitamin B6 you need as well. Okay. You do see a little bit required for glycogen metabolism, specifically in the muscle. So we said we store sugar as glycogen, right, in our liver and muscle. So that glycogen metabolism requires vitamin B6 as well. Okay. Fairly rare deficiencies, similar to malnutrition, right? So we talked about, protein deficiency. So it's very similar symptoms as general malnutrition. So you see some convulsions, dermatitis. It can be caused by antagonists, so things that are blocking the function of vitamin B6, or damage during food processing, so you don't get the vitamin B6 very well if you've damaged it in the food. Okay, but again, it's a very rare deficiency. Toxicity is also unlikely. You have to get very high doses. You can see again that those convulsions, paralysis, death, but very unlikely. So both deficiencies and toxicities are rare and unlikely for vitamin B6. So one of our last B vitamins, we'll talk a few more, but they have their own specific names, but vitamin B12 or cobalamin is one that is very popular these days. Probably a lot of you guys have heard of it or know about it. You can get vitamin B12 shots and supplements, but essentially the primary source of B12 is microbial synthesis, so it's not made by plants or animals. We do get a dietary source by animal products, but it's not absorbed very well. And it's the smallest requirement of any of the vitamins, so we don't require very much of it. So even though it's absorbed poorly, we do have a microbial synthesis source. We also store it. So it's a little bit different than some of our other B vitamins, where we actually store it quite well in most animals, except cats, but they're carnivores, so they have a good animal product source for in their diet. So what is the function of B12? So it's a coenzyme, just like we've been talking about. A lot of these vitamins are coenzymes, and it's for a very few very important metabolic enzymes and metabolic activities. So it's also important in ruminant metabolism, so they specifically need a source of cobalt to work with their vitamin B12, but it is very important in their metabolism. It is closely associated with folacin or folic acid, and we'll talk about folic acid next. So they kind of work together in the same metabolic activities. And one of the big things that vitamin B12 does is it helps with nutrient absorption in the GI. So I think especially in older people, they recommend, B12 shots and things because, nutrient absorption in the GI definitely decreases with age. And so this can help with that absorption of nutrients. So that's a big one as well. So not only is it an important coenzyme, but it's also for nutrient absorption. So we do see some deficiencies. So they can be fairly common. So because we don't absorb it very well, we do see some deficiencies. So anemia, neurological problems, wasting syndrome, meaning, just weight loss, wasting, poor doing essentially, because you're not getting those nutrients. So you can either have an absence of the B12 or cobalt in the diet to get this deficiency, especially in ruminants, right, where they need that cobalt. You can see a bacterial overgrowth or even genetic abnormalities that can cause this deficiency. So essentially, wasting disease, wasting syndrome is very common with this absence of cobalt or vitamin B12. So now we'll talk about folacin, also known as folic acid. I love how they often change names of vitamins, or they have multiple different names, so it can be quite confusing. But folic acid is found in a lot of leafy vegetables, citrus fruit, and even organ meats, but it can be damaged by heat and light. So cooking can damage it. So raw veggies and fruit are much better sources. And folic acid is required for DNA synthesis and red cell production. So DNA synthesis, that's very important, red cell production, so lots of important things for folic acid. It also has some metabolic activity with vitamin B12 that we just talked about, so they work together. Not very common for deficiencies. You don't see it that often, but you do see, when you see it, you see decreased growth, right? DNA synthesis, birth defects, anemia, so, low red blood cells is what we see with deficiencies, if we see it at all. Not too common. So our next vitamin is biotin. Some people call it a B vitamin, some people call it vitamin H. I think the safest is just to call it biotin, right? That's what most people refer to it as. And we do see microbial synthesis of biotin in the GI tract. And we do have some good dietary sources as well. Eggs, liver, so liver, kidneys, organ meats, yeast, fruits and veggies. So lots of good dietary sources for biotin. And again, it's a coenzyme for some important enzymes, okay? So these enzymes are required for carbohydrate metabolism, fatty acid synthesis, gluconeogenesis, right, where we make glucose from other things, amino acid deamination, so lots of important metabolic functions for these enzymes. Again, it's very rare to have a deficiency in biotin because we have that microbial synthesis. So a lot of these vitamins that have, microbial synthesis, it's very rare to see deficiencies because as long as your, microbe population is okay, then usually you get a source of it from that synthesis. But we do see some severe dermatitis, hair loss, cracked hooves is a big one in horses or hooved animals. And so there are a lot of supplements out there for people as well because it helps with nail health and hair health. is biotin supplements. So very good for kind of hair and nails. Okay. So now let's talk about choline. So it's not your typical water-soluble vitamin. So it's not a B vitamin. It's not a coenzyme. It's a structural component. And it can be synthesized in the liver. So we actually require it in quite large quantities in comparison to our other vitamins. And we do find some good dietary sources of choline in fats, eggs, liver, fish, and oil seeds. So lots of good dietary sources, and we can synthesize it. So what is its function? Okay, so it has a structural role in the cell membrane, and it's very important in the transmission of nerve impulses. So it's part of a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. So let's talk about that in a minute. We do see some deficiencies. You can get a fatty liver, cirrhosis, hemorrhagic lesions, so some different deficiencies that we can see with choline, but it's very important for the development of the nervous system as well. So let's look at the function of choline in acetylcholine. So this picture is showing a synapse, so between either two neurons or at the end of a neuron and a muscle, whatever that may be. The structure on the left-hand side, the blue, is the end of the axon of a neuron. Okay, so there's going to be this action potential that's coming down the axon from the neuron. And what happens is it actually releases acetylcholine into the synaptic cleft, so this kind of space in between the next neuron or the muscle or gland or whatever it's stimulating. And essentially that acetylcholine is released and binds to a receptor on the other side of the synapse, and that's going to cause kind of an excitatory potential and an action potential that's going to continue either through the muscle or through the next neuron. So it's a neurotransmitter is what we call it. So it helps to transmit that signal from one neuron to the next or to a muscle, whatever that may be. So acetylcholine is made up from acetate and choline and can be synthesized and broken down in this kind of synaptic area. Okay. So our last water-soluble vitamin we'll talk about is vitamin C. So I know a lot of people are very familiar with ascorbic acid, vitamin C. We mostly think of it just in citrus fruits, but you actually can find it in some vegetables and animal products as well. Now, most species can make it from glucose, except for some of us. So some species, such as primates, us, some fish, snakes, birds, fruit bats, and guinea pigs, we cannot make it from glucose. So we require a dietary source of vitamin C. And the functions of vitamin C is it's a really good reducing agent. So it is an antioxidant, which is very good, and it reduces some metal ions and can help with and enhance iron absorption. So that's very important. Collagen synthesis, so it helps with producing collagen fibers, which is very important in connective tissues. And it's part of the formation of epinephrine. So epinephrine is kind of our stress hormone, right? When you kind of the fight or flight hormone. So it has to do with that as well. Okay. So what are some deficiencies? And this is really only seen in species that can't make it, right? So we can see vitamin C deficiencies in humans and those other animals that can't make it. and we call it scurvy. So we can see scurvy in humans, so you can get hemorrhage, slow clotting, swollen bleeding gums, tooth loss, weight loss, emaciation, diarrhea, all that good stuff. But you also see some slow wound healing, muscle and joint pain as well. So lots of fun things that can happen with vitamin C deficiency. Toxicity is fairly rare because we have a high tolerance for vitamin C, but in very large doses it can affect some trace element utilization. So we'll talk about trace elements and minerals in the next lecture, so it can affect that a little bit as well. So what is the big thing surrounding vitamin C, right? Is that it's pushed with immune function, and that you should get your vitamin C if you are fighting an infection, right? So it's a mighty antioxidant, and it helps your immune system and helps your stress response. So is that kind of true? So there was a study that found that there was decreased excretion of vitamin C with an infection, suggesting that we utilize vitamin C more so during an infection. And it does have some bactericidal activity, means it kills bacteria at very high doses. But there's no actual supportive evidence that it is needed during an infection, but does it help, right? So, you know, there's a lot of this push for vitamin C during an infection, but there's not a whole lot of supportive evidence that that it's definitely not required, but could it help, right? So here's a table just to help us out too, to show what kind of requirements might be for dogs for some of these vitamins, what the sources could be, signs of deficiencies in dogs if you have a vitamin deficiency. So just kind of another good reference table. And again, you don't need to memorize any of the, you know, recommended daily dosages or anything like that for these guys. Just have a good general idea of the different water-soluble vitamins, some of their functions, right? Some of their sources, some of the deficiencies. But again, and there's some generalization across the board, and know some of those ones that kind of stick out that are a little bit different, okay? So here's just an example of an adult maintenance dog food, just to give you an idea of what's in there. And I've highlighted or bolded and underlined some of those vitamins in there, just to give you an idea of what a dog food may look like, what they add, right, to the diet. Okay, so not only does, you know, the food stuffs have a source of vitamins, but also they add in the supplemental vitamins as well. Okay. So that's it for vitamins, and next week we are going to talk about minerals, so macro and micro minerals. So a couple chapters there from the book to cover those minerals. All right, I'll see you guys next week.